Welcome back, everybody. What you're about to hear is not a threat anymore. It's policy. For months, the United States has been warning Iran about a very specific kind of retaliation, one aimed not at military bases or missile silos, but at the literal infrastructure that keeps the country running, bridges, power plants, the stuff of everyday civilian life. And now that warning has moved from a talking point into an actual operating doctrine that's already being carried out, let's break down exactly what changed, why it changed, and what it means for a war that just found a brand new way to escalate. Here's what happened. After a fresh round of Iranian attacks on commercial vessels transiting the Strait of Hormuz, the American president issued a direct public ultimatum. From that point forward, every single time Iran fired at a ship in the strait, whether by missile, rocket, drone, or any other weapon, the United States would respond by destroying one bridge or one power plant inside Iran. And critically, the statement specified that targets located in or near the capital city of Tehran were explicitly on the table. That last detail is the part that should stop you. Tehran isn't just another city on a map. It's the seat of power. It's where the regime has consolidated its leadership. Putting infrastructure near the capital on a target list is a direct signal to the people running the country that their own stronghold no longer sits behind some invisible line of protection. Iran's response came fast, and it came through state media rather than a formal diplomatic channel. An unnamed Iranian military source told a state-run news agency that if American forces target a bridge or power plant inside Iran, Tehran would strike back at infrastructure and energy facilities across the region, explicitly including sites tied to American interests. So within hours of one threat landing, a mirror image threat landed right back. That's the pattern that's defined nearly every escalation point in this war. One side raises the stakes, the other side matches it almost immediately, and the gap between threat and action keeps shrinking every single time. But here's the problem with treating this as some brand new idea that appeared out of nowhere. It isn't. What nobody outside of people closely tracking this conflict noticed is that this exact threat has actually been made more than once already this year, going back through earlier phases of the war. Back in the spring, the American president set a hard deadline for Iran to reopen the strait, warning that failure to comply would mean what he called Power Plant Day and Bridge Day rolled into one, language blunt enough that it left very little room for interpretation. That deadline came and went more than once, with the administration alternately extending it and then walking it back after diplomats claimed progress was being made. At one point, the White House explicitly paused the threat for 5 days to give mediators room to work. So this is not the first time bridges and power plants have been dangled as leverage. What's different this time is that the policy isn't tied to a single deadline anymore. It's now a standing, automatic rule triggered by any future attack on shipping, not a one-time ultimatum that can quietly expire. That's not the end of it either. This isn't purely theoretical anymore, because infrastructure inside Iran has already been hit under exactly this kind of justification. Reporting from earlier this year documented a railway bridge west of Tehran struck as part of a broader wave of strikes targeting regime logistics and infrastructure, with images showing the damaged structure in the days that followed. So the groundwork for treating bridges as legitimate military targets, not just rhetorical threats, was already being laid months before this latest ultimatum turned it into official policy. Let's talk about why targeting power plants and bridges is such a different kind of pressure than targeting a missile site or a drone base, because the logic here is worth understanding on its own terms. A power plant isn't just a military asset. It's the thing that keeps hospitals running, keeps water treatment operating, keeps ordinary households functioning day to day. Same with a bridge, particularly if it's a key node in a country's transportation and logistics network. Hitting those targets doesn't just degrade a regime's fighting capacity, it degrades the basic functioning of civilian life, which creates a completely different kind of pressure than a strike on a military installation ever could. That's precisely why this kind of targeting sits in such a legally and ethically fraught space, and why even people who support a hardline approach toward Iran have raised questions about where exactly this policy draws its lines. Here's where things get more complicated. Iran's own government understands exactly how this kind of pressure works, because it's been threatening the same kind of retaliation right back. Officials in Tehran have said publicly that if their power plants get hit, they'll consider infrastructure across the broader region fair game, specifically naming energy and water facilities that Gulf countries depend on, including desalination plants that provide drinking water to millions of people living nowhere near the actual fighting. Iran's parliament speaker went as far as warning that regional infrastructure could be, in his words, irreversibly destroyed if Tehran's own facilities are targeted first. That's not a subtle threat. That's Iran explicitly signaling that, if this fight moves into targeting civilian infrastructure, it's prepared to drag every country in the region into that same category of target, whether they're an active combatant or not. And that's really the fear driving a lot of the quiet anxiety among Gulf allies watching this play out. Countries like the UAE and Qatar don't have a direct stake in the underlying dispute over Hormuz shipping lanes the way Iran and the United States do, but their power grids, their desalination plants, and their economic infrastructure are all sitting well within range if this kind of tit-for-tat targeting keeps expanding. What started as a dispute over commercial shipping through one narrow strait has, through this specific policy, created a scenario where an entire region's basic utilities are theoretically on the table. Now, let's get into what's actually documented as having happened on the ground, because the human cost here isn't abstract. Iranian health officials have reported that U.S. strikes have killed dozens of people inside the country since the most recent wave of the campaign resumed, with several hundred more reported wounded, and Iranian state media has separately reported sharply rising food prices as the broader economic strain of sustained conflict starts showing up in ordinary people's daily lives. Those figures, as always with numbers coming out of a government with every incentive to shape the narrative in its own favor, deserve real scrutiny rather than blind acceptance. But even accounting for that skepticism, there's no serious dispute that this campaign has produced real civilian and military casualties on a meaningful scale, and that the economic strain inside Iran is compounding with every week this continues. That's not the end of it, though, because the American side has framed this entire approach as one it believes it can sustain far longer than Iran can. At a public event, the president made a point of arguing that the United States doesn't actually need the Strait of Hormuz for its own energy security, citing the combined oil output of the U.S. and Venezuela as evidence Washington could functionally ignore the strait altogether if it had to, while adding that the campaign continues because of concerns over Iran's nuclear ambitions rather than purely about the waterway itself. He also claimed the U.S. was winning against Iran, pointing to unverified figures on Iranian civilian casualties during recent domestic unrest as evidence the regime was losing control at home. That framing matters, because it tells you how Washington is justifying the sustainability of this pressure campaign. If the argument is that America doesn't strictly need Hormuz, and Iran is already destabilizing internally, that's a rationale for staying the course indefinitely rather than negotiating a quick off-ramp. Let's shift to the diplomatic side, because that's been running in parallel this entire time, even as the threats over bridges and power plants escalate. The Secretary of State, speaking at a regional gathering in Manila, said publicly that Iran doesn't currently appear serious about reaching a deal, pointing out that Tehran had made commitments in a memorandum of understanding reached in the prior month and violated it within 2 weeks. That's a pattern that keeps repeating throughout this entire conflict. An agreement gets reached. Both sides describe it publicly as a genuine step forward, and within a matter of days or weeks it collapses under the weight of the next provocation. Turkey and Egypt have both stepped in at points as informal mediators, with Turkey's foreign minister reportedly in direct phone contact with his Iranian counterpart, and Egypt's president saying his government has delivered what he called clear messages to Tehran aimed at de-escalation. None of that diplomatic activity has produced anything close to a durable resolution yet. So here's the honest, uncomfortable read on where this actually leaves things. This bridges and power plants policy isn't a one-off threat anymore. It's become a standing rule of engagement, automatically triggered by the next Iranian attack on shipping, whenever that happens. And Iran has responded by making clear it considers regional infrastructure fair game in return. That means the next flashpoint in this war might not look like a missile exchange between military targets at all. It might look like an electrical grid going dark in a city that had nothing to do with the fighting, or a water treatment plant in a Gulf state losing power because of a policy set in motion by a dispute over a shipping lane hundreds of miles away. And that's the part of this story that deserves more attention than it's gotten. Wars fought over military targets are, in some grim sense, more contained. Everyone involved generally understands the categories of things that are and aren't fair game. What this bridges and power plants policy does is blur that line deliberately, turning civilian infrastructure into a bargaining chip in a way that both sides now seem willing to escalate rather than walk back. Every previous version of this exact threat, going back through the spring of this year, eventually got extended, delayed, or quietly shelved while diplomats worked the phones. The open question now is whether this version holds the same way, or whether the automatic nature of this new policy, no deadline, no off-ramp, just an automatic response triggered by the next attack, means it actually gets carried out the next time Iran tests the strait. What do you think happens from here? Does this kind of infrastructure for infrastructure retaliation actually deter Iran from testing Hormuz again? Or does it just guarantee the next escalation hits closer to ordinary people's daily lives than anything we've seen so far in this war? Let me know what you think in the comments below, and if you want to keep tracking exactly how this policy plays out, make sure you're subscribed, because between the threats, the diplomacy, And what's already been struck on the ground, this story is clearly still writing itself. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next one.